Welcome back to another episode of the Bourbon Lens, and in this episode we go across the pond and we're talking Scotch whiskey. And not just any Scotch whiskey, we're talking Benromach, 50-year-old, and a wide variety of their lineup as well. And so sit back and buckle into the latest episode of the Bourbon Lens. Keith Cruickshank of Benromach Distillery. I'm trying to use all of my Scottish accent that I do not have. Thank you for hopping on this episode of the Bourbon Lens and walking us through everything that is Benromach today.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. Yeah, it's a pleasure. It's a lovely cold afternoon here in Scotland, to say the least. So yeah, it's great. Thanks very much for inviting me. And I'm looking forward to obviously sharing some of my experiences, my thoughts about Benromach and some of the lovely whiskies we've created over the last 26 years.
I mean, it's gotta be crazy. And so 26, but you have a 50-year-old. So we'll have to figure out how all of that kind of comes into play. But, for you, can you just explain a little bit about how Benromach got started and, where you all came from and where you all are going?
Yeah, so Benromach was built with a whiskey boom back in 1898, and it's had a few owners in its time, to be quite honest with you. And it wasn't really until after the Second World War when the whiskey industry in general had sustained productivity. And it was a good time for the whiskey industry. The markets opened, especially in even the States where Scotch was so popular. And a lot of distilleries sustained good productivity, and Benromach was no different to them. And after the war, prior to the war, it was actually owned by an American company, Trainer McIntyre. That was then transferred to DCL or SMD, Scottish Malt Distillers, about 1953. And then they operated the site from 53 to 1983. And unfortunately, Scottish Malt Distillers closed probably about 30% of the distilleries during that. Wasn't the greatest time for Scotch whisky, and there was many reasons why. There was a downturn in the markets and such like for the industry, but they had a choice and they closed about a third of the distilleries, and unfortunately Benromach was one of that distilleries that got closed. It lay silent, dormant, or mothballed, but it wasn't. The site probably wasn't in its best condition, and the previous owners respectfully probably had no intention of opening this distillery again. Luckily, Gordon and MacPhail, the current owners, were looking to purchase their first distillery. And they're obviously Gordon and MacPhail are an independent bottler, wine, whiskey specialist. But they weren't a distiller, and that was their dream, was to own their own distillery and become a manufacturer and distiller. That dream came about in 1993 when they bought the site from United Distillers at that time, who now obviously are called Diageo. They bought the site in 1993, the rights to Benromach, and that was basically the start of the journey. Gordon MacPhail had to refit the whole distillery. It took 5 years. It actually only took 2 years, but 5 years was the time span for consultancy and seeing what style whiskey they want to produce. The size of the equipment, because Benromach was a different size of distillery than it is now, different equipment. There wasn't any equipment left, really. The equipment was cannibalised, would be the kindest way to, if that is a kind way to say it. There was nothing left. Gordon MacPhail had a blank canvas, which was beneficial. And they started producing again the summer of 1998 and chose a very specific, kind of a lost Speyside style is the best way to describe it. The whiskey was to be made using traditional whiskey making methods. So it is very traditional here at the distillery. The operator controls the whole process from start to finish. We use traditional wooden washbacks, traditional sherry casks, at a high proportion. And the most noticeable part is we introduced that lost, delicate smokiness from Speysides that were there many, many decades ago. And that's the style, that's the character that Gordon MacPhail decided to reintroduce or bring back, is this lost Speyside style. And that's the whole thread about Benromach. Traditionally made, traditional whiskey making methods, and that lovely, delicate smokiness that comes through in most of the Benromachs that you've got, the 10, 15. Not so much, definitely not the one that we're going to speak about, the Benromach 50. This is where that style obviously did change, So that's probably this. So we started producing in 1998, and that was 26 years ago. My journey started in 1998 as a young man, as a distiller, and then I became manager in 2000, and I've been managing the site for 24 years now, and I've had the pleasure of seeing whiskey, the whiskey develop, the brand develop, all the products. So it's kind of been a journey for me as well. So, and it's very fortunate to have that. Never get that again. It's very seldom you get a chance to start a new distillery. I say a new distillery, but you know what I mean. It's not a new distillery. It's an old distillery, but a new lease of life for the distillery. Because it would probably never have been restarted again if it wasn't for Gordon MacPhail buying the site and then releasing that lease of life back into distillery. So yeah, it's been a long journey. It's been quick. It feels like just yesterday, but it wasn't yesterday,
Yeah.
26 years but I remember as a young distiller back in 98, fast whiskey coming off the stills. And I'm thinking, oh, wow, it's going to be ages before this becomes whiskey. Ages. But it's amazing how the time comes rolling in. 2009, 10-year-old. And then 2019, 20-year-old, 28 years. And then it's 26 years. It's amazing.
Yeah.
It flies in, all these new craft distillers that start up now, they've got that to experience, which is, it is great.
Yeah. So talk to us a little bit about smokiness. Obviously, we know that Islay is traditionally equated to, kind of that smoky, earthy, peated whiskey. So introducing this in a Speyside, area where most people think of traditional single malts, big sherry bombs kind of come from Speyside. Obviously, you're using sherry. But how are you all introducing the smoke element? Is it through peated malt, or how are you all creating that?
You can only get it through peated malt. So traditionally, you would have malted the barley on site. I mean, that stopped in the late 1960s throughout Scotland. The same time as the commercialised maltings started to develop in Scotland. Agriculture changed as well. Combine harvesters, things like that. It's and maltings as well. They're all commercialised maltings and they all started to come in to Scotland in the late 60s. So most of the traditional floor maltings at each distillery gradually used less and less of their own and bought from, and there was that transition period. And eventually all the malted barley would have been bought from, or most of it would have been bought from, there's still a handful do traditional floor maltings, but it's still very unique and niche for that. So you can only get the smokiness from the malted barley.
Yeah.
And traditionally, the whiskey from the West Coast was, and it still is to this day, it's very robust, medicinal, very strong, but it's very heavily peated. Not them all, as we all know, but traditionally, most of the Irish whiskies have that strong. So normally in Scotland, you would have had the beautiful, as you said, the sherry, mellow, beautiful, fruity Speysides, and then you had the West Coast beasts. They were beautiful whiskies as well.
Yeah.
But really different. You couldn't have gotten any further apart if you tried. And normally there was never anything in between, or very little in between, that offered maybe that something a bit softer and smoky. Again, it's still there. And for Benromach, that gave us that opportunity because, in the 1950s and 60s, when they were still doing traditional floor maltings, peat was still used. So the Speysides back then, I say Speysides back then tongue-in-cheek because there really wasn't a Speyside character back then. You didn't have what they called Speysides. It was just whiskey made from this area. Single malts weren't even, thought about really back then to a certain extent. Scotch was and blending was, and still is to this day. So that smokiness was in the character, and that's what gave Gormanfield the inspiration or the style to bring back, because they had bottled single malt in the 50s, 60s, and 70s as 8, 10, 12-year-old malts, and they still had that liquid library of samples and such like that they could look back on. Yeah, the samples were old, of course they were, but they could look back on the character of whiskies like Linkwood, Mortmac, Strathyla, Glenlivet, some of these that were that they bottled, and that's the style. That's the inspiration. The Linkwood, things like that. That's the inspiration they took for the style they wanted to create at Benromach.
Yeah.
And that's the story. But you can only get smokiness from the malted barley, and you specify
Yeah.
how much you want. There's only two kinds of There's only two kinds of malted barley you can have: unpeated and heavily peated. There ain't nothing in between. No monster can ever hit, and that's all you've got. So obviously, Benromach, we're about 10, 12 phenols ppm.
Yeah.
They blend it. So they blend heavily peated and unpeated, and that's how it's done.
Got it.
It's not the most scientific way of doing it. You go to the maltsters and ask them, but it's the way it's done.
Yeah. Well, most of the time it's in whiskey, it's happy accidents, right? Like you ran something one way and it's like, oh, that kind of worked. Well, let's repeat that a couple more times.
Exactly. Sometimes it's not. I mean, the distillery, don't get me wrong, the distilleries are the technology that runs distilleries nowadays is very, very high tech, and the heat recovery systems that's used is. However, there is traditional distilleries, quite a lot of the iconic distilleries that's out there that are still very, very well manually operated, and things are done very in very certain ways that can seem very strange indeed, like, rather than being kind of so scientific and so prescripted,
Mm-hmm.
And Benromach's no different. We do things in quite very specific ways, like which would look different again.
Yeah.
So yeah, but certainly the malting part, when they peat it can be, it's not an exact science, to say the least. But yeah. If you want 12 ppm, they'll blend unpeated with peated, heavily peated, and that's how you get it. And you can order whatever, and that's what we do at Benromach. So it gives us that lovely, elegant smokiness that we associate with Benromach.
Yeah.
So from a production standpoint, where is that blending occurring? Is it occurring
Maltings
in the what's that?
The maltings do it. We don't. Most of the distilleries buy the malt from maltings or commercialized maltings. So you'll just have a contract. So harvest is finished in Scotland for the moment. So all the barley is in, it's been dried, it's been stored at the maltings. This is the time when we do our contracts with the maltsters. So for next year, so the crop 2024 will become product 2025 or malt 2025. Normally, the start of the year, January, it's ready to start being sold. Maybe December, it's ready to go through the steeps and such like. There's always a small, I say dormancy, but it's not really dormancy. There's a stage where it's not ready to steep and germinate. So it'll sit there once it's dried and then ready to go, probably November to start going out, maybe December, January. So we'll do the contracts at the moment for next year, the whole contract for the year. I don't know, 1,000 tons, 3,000 tons of unpeated, lightly peated, heavily peated, whatever we want. And that's what we'll stipulate from them. They do the blending there at the maltings. So they'll make batches of heavily peated, store that, and then they'll either sell it as heavily peated, or they'll blend it with unpeated to XY specification.
Gotcha.
Or like most distilleries in Scotland, they will just buy unpeated, which is the majority is obviously peated malt's quite a small percentage. However, it is niche, and it is, it's growing all the time, so it's premium to get peated malt as well. So it's sometimes not the easiest to get, because everybody wants it, it's that thing that, especially for single malts, everybody wants to have a peated version of what they produce. However, we've always bought peated malt. That's the advantage we had as a distiller. we bought peated malt when it wasn't that fashionable or growing. And the maltsters, we always supported the maltsters, they supported us. So we kind of make sure we secure, because we've been taking peated malt for 26 years, we'll always get peated malt for them, because that's the kind of relationship you have with the maltsters. So, that's what business is. It's a relationship like anything else, based on trust and such like. And the whiskey industry is no different,
Yeah.
So, yeah, they blend it at the maltings to answer the initial question. Yeah.
Yeah. So you're not having to distill peated and then distill unpeated malt.
No.
You're getting your
You can't do
grain.
that. I mean, we don't. I mean, you can do it at the back end. We can produce batches of heavily peated whiskey and unpeated whiskey, and then we can marry that together. You can do that, It's sometimes can be difficult to try and get the balance just right and such like, but yeah, but normally you wouldn't do that to get what you want, because
because you're getting a consistent profile at the 10 and 15, right?
Yeah.
And so you want to have that consistency.
That's why we do that, because we allow it we want that 10, 12 ppm to mature at 10, 12 ppm, not unpeated matured and heavily peated matured. Dig it together. That kind of doesn't
make the balance really hard. Do you all, so I know you talked about sherry cask. Do you all do ex-bourbon cask too, or do you only put?
Yeah, we do. No, we do. We fill about 60-70% is in sherry, European oak, seasoned sherry cask Oloroso, and the remaining is in American white oak.
Okay. Yeah.
So we buy our cask we get it from the Speyside cooperage.
Yeah.
We don't buy direct at the moment. However, it's something that we're looking into.
Yeah.
Cask availability is always the challenge. In sustainability and environment, that's always the big challenges of can. Is it sustainable? Which it is at the moment. It certainly is. Certainly our supply of American white oak, as long as don't start using 2 or 3 times and then we're in trouble, So, however, maybe not. Yeah.
Great thing we got legislation for that over here, that we can only use it once, and we got to get it going.
Yeah, you've got that, which is good. However, there's a reason why you only use it once.
Yep. For sure.
We're okay. We can use it 2 or 3. At Benromach, we do use festival predominantly in the festival sherry and festival American white oak, like Ken. So they both work. We would always have both because we can. It's a 10, 15, such like they're married together.
Yeah.
They're allowed to mature separately, of course, and then we take them together.
Mingle.
As the marrying process to get that beautiful flavours to kind of come together.
So as an American, right, like that's you used to non-peated whiskey, right? So a lot of times, like you can throw out a variety of non-peated scotches that may be a good American crossover, and for this, just kind of warming my palate up and drinking some of the 10-year, it's a really beautiful whiskey. I've had some peated whiskeys that I just despise. I'm going to be honest. Like, it's just not my palate. Like it's no one's done anything wrong. Just, I'm not used to it. How would you, and this is kind of a hard question, how would you recommend an American approach a peated whiskey, right? Like thought process or sipping process? Cause I feel like that's the most difficult thing. People are like, oh, I don't like that peated stuff. And I'm like, there's so much non-peated scotch. Like you can get into that. That's fine. But
it really is a difficult one, because there's very few beverages, spirit drinks out there that flavor is dominant in. There's food, yes, because you cure meat and fish and ham and everything with that smoking process. So that's not, but when you actually get an alcohol beverage and you put it in your mouth and suddenly you've got this flavor, it's like, an alien's just landed on your head. It's quite, and it's such a powerful flavor as well. Phenols have got such a low aroma threshold that it does, and it's a strange one. You could say, well, you can slowly, and most people do go into it slowly and and try maybe Benromach is a good introduction in Ardmore, and maybe even Talisker as well. Though Talisker has got some other beautiful characters, but trying a whiskey. So I mean, most of my family and friends are all they're devout Speyside drinkers, and if you give them a whiff of peat, they'll come and yeah, they'll come at you. It's that, you know. And that's it is quite difficult, you know, if you're used to that, the Speysides, because they're beautiful whiskies, you know, and then suddenly. But the key thing would be to probably just to start. Benromach is a great introduction to peat. Maybe not the 10, because the 10 for me is beautiful and it's still got that rich smokiness, but possibly the 15, where you've got that delicate smokiness in the back, but the rich Speyside style coming through.
Yeah.
So that's a great introduction. And then once you get that taste, it then becomes normal that, yeah, that's normal. And then you can maybe possibly start going into something a bit more. You know, when I was the same, I didn't start drinking whiskey till I was in my 30s, if you can believe that. Never. And I just slowly got into the single malt, and then I drink heavily peated whiskies. It's no problem whatsoever. Love them.
Mm-hmm.
Couldn't drink too many of them because it's very overpowering, you know.
But you won't taste much after the third one.
Yeah, I mean, it depends what you're having. I mean, normally I might have a couple of 15s and then finish off with a Cleela or something like that. And I love Ardbeg and Lefroy as well. I love Lefroy. Everybody looks at me thinking, Lefroy. Lefroy's a beautiful.
Well, that's what I was going to say. The 15 is so much that smoke takes a back seat. The 10s, the smoke's a little more up front. Scott, I don't know what your thoughts are.
The 15 would be a good introduction if you wanted to kind of get you. And most of my family and friends are Speyside drinkers, and when they drink the 15, they love it because they seem to remark on that. It's not that unusual flavour, but it's like, oh yeah, that smoking level's just enough for me. It's just enough. And it's so enjoyable as well. It's a beautiful flavour, but it's just like, it's a strange one. I always remember James McEwen or Jim McEwen, okay, from Ireland. And Jim's a character. I met him. I've only ever met him once. He came to the distillery in the early years, and he's one of that characters you never forget. And he always said, all you ever need when you come to Ireland is a smile. That's all he said. You never need money, you just need a smile. And I always remember that. And he says, no, he said, drinking peated whiskey, it's a bit like when you take off in an airplane. And he says, take off for a start, and it can be a bit bumpy. And he says, you're coming up, and when you go through clouds, sometimes it can be a bit. And he says, that's what you have to get through with peated malt. You got to get through that initial clouds, he says, the bumpiness, they're used to it. And then he said, once you get through the clouds, he says, look what you've got. And that's how he described getting through peated whiskey, just to kind of get through that initial. And I was in Kentucky 2019. Fantastic. Wonderful place. Wonderful people. So friendly. Absolutely friendliest people in the world. They were to me anyway.
Well, I hope you think that we're friendly since we're both from Kentucky.
Yeah, absolutely. Most friendliest people in the world. And I remember going to, which distillery was it again? Angel's Envy. Went to Angel's Envy distillery there. And they didn't have many products. I think they only had one or two, if that. And I remember them always speaking about the initial, when you drink bourbon for a start, you get, what do they call it? Something like a Kentucky hug or something like that. Or that's exactly. And I always remember that description, that you get that lovely, warm, that feeling. And he said the second one is the one that you really enjoy.
Yeah.
The most. Yeah. And I guess peated malt maybe is similar to that, where you just need to. But yeah, probably the 15. The Benromach 15 is a great introduction if you're not used to peated whiskies. But I do sympathise and understand why it can be quite a shock to the system when you drink.
This is a barbecue whiskey. Like, it's got the sweetness, it's got some nuttiness, it's got well-rounded, but like that smoke is at the end. So it's like you had a nice piece of like barbecued burnt chicken that's got like the grill marks on it, and you take a bite out of it and you're like, oh, Like there's that smoke there that like it smoked the chicken for a while, but it's got like the grill marks. Like
That's the nicest smokiness when you get that kind of like a bacon. We call it bacon sandwiches or bacon rolls,
yeah.
and you've got that, you know.
Mhm.
And then you have the more medicinal ones. It's not the ones I'm overly keen on. The sweeter ones. Kalila is a fantastic one because it's not the heaviest of the phenols for Isla, but the flavour comes through the esters that come through there. The banana notes and such like are fantastic. It's one of my favourite Isla whiskies.
Yeah.
It's clean. You never really meant to. We've got other brands when you're on thing, but I always do, and you always remember to speak about them fondly.
Yeah.
Always, you know. And yeah. It's
So
yeah.
we've gotten the background and we've talked a little bit about the peated things, but now we got the Piece de la Resistance. We have the Benromach 50, which
That's the
is a beautiful bottle. We don't have the bottle, but the bottle is gorgeous. It's handmade. There's only 248 bottles made total.
248 decanters of bottles we got from the outturn, like Ken. So the whiskey is obviously a 1972 whiskey. Whiskey is quite rare for the Benromach. When we started in 98, we had stocks of 1960s, 1970s, and very early 1980s. I think we still got some in the 1970s, but it's still, the stocks are getting less and less, and they're getting older and older. And we've released 30, 35, 40, which was well received. And now the 50, obviously.
Yeah.
Which was a big thing for us. It always is every time we take out a new expression from the new distillery or the younger, it's 30 or 21 years, not a younger, but anyway, it's always a big thing for us. So we've got this 2 layers of releases. One is the whiskey from the distillery post 1998, and then we have releases from our heritage. This is a heritage whiskey, a legacy whiskey, if you want to call it, you know. And they both kind of get released at different times. So this is our latest release, the Benromach 50. So it was a big thing for us. They've had a big release of it. So hopefully it's like a halo product for the whole brand. The whiskey is different. It was made at a completely different time. It was made in the 1970s, you know. So the whiskey would have definitely been unpeated. The whiskey back in the Floor Maltons would have been finished at that time, the late 1960s, 68, I think they stopped that. There might have been a little bit of smoke in there, but it's probably highly unlikely, you know. So, and obviously it was matured in sherry casks. This one its life had been 2 sherry casks, so originally, and then it was transferred to another sherry cask just to give it that little boost of freshness that's invigorated back up again. So just to give that. So yeah, but it's a lovely whiskey. It has that typical kind of fruitiness that Benromach is normally associated with. They always say about fruitcake. Fruitcake is such a generic term, but you know what we mean by that. The lovely raisins, sultanas, the figs, and all that kind of stuff. But Benromach always has that kind of pineapple, apples, and fruity character coming through. So, but yeah, it's very mellow. It's very complex in its flavour, but it's it's quite a special whiskey. I think every one that we released from at this age for the legacy whiskies or heritage is very, very special indeed. You know,
this might be one of the more special whiskeys I've ever nosed in my life. Like it's really robust on the nose.
Yeah, and it's not overly mature. It's not overly woody. It's definitely not. Some whiskies can really be off-putting by the level of tannins and wood and such like you get. But it's kept that lovely freshness coming through, Ken. But the kind of banana, the estery notes, which is that kind of bananas and the apples seem to be there quite a lot, you know. There is that. Benromach almost has that citrus note. And you get different types of citrus, obviously, and there's always a different type of citrus in every Benromach bottling that I've done in different ways, you know. But normally you get that kind of the orange zest comes through, which is lovely. It's an orange zest, a beautiful character come through, you know. And peppery notes is another thing. There's
I would
quite a lot
say
of
that
these.
pepper's definitely there.
Yeah, but that peppery note is quite a thread of flavour that comes through, not just in the old Benromachs, but some of the younger ones, the ones that was released post 1998, which you could say could be a coincidence or not, you know. But that thread of flavour comes through in a lot of the Benromachs. It is a thread, okay? They were made in completely different eras, different equipment, and by different people.
Mm.
But they were all made at Benromach, and that's probably one of the most important parts is where it was made, the people and such like. Because every distillery's got a story. It's from a place. It's always amazing, like Scotch whisky. You've got these huge multinational brands and sold throughout the world.
Mm.
You know, thousands of cases enjoyed by millions. And then the distillery is in this tiny little village tucked in the hillside in Scotland. You know, it's quite amazing to have that. You know, and there's always every distillery is connected to a town. Always, you know, Macallan's a huge brand, beautiful whiskey. You know, you've got Archton, you've got Craigellachie, which are the small, tiny villages next to this. You know, and in Benromach's the same. We've got the town of Forres, and it's always been connected because so much people have worked at these distilleries and built up their livelihoods over many decades. So, yeah.
Scott, what are your thoughts on this? I mean, I think it's a really robust whiskey that keeps like changing a little bit in my palate.
Yeah, I would almost say I like the fruitcake note because it's kind of like just layers of flavor.
Yeah.
But I was kind of thinking like it's almost like those rum cakes that you get because you get that little bit of the little bit of punch of alcohol because I feel like this is probably a higher proof. You get that, but then it's also just like creamy, buttery, like the mouthfeel is probably the best part of this. Like it just kind of carries all those flavors for you.
Yeah. And the finish was got quite a long finish as well, you know?
Yeah.
So with the complexity as well, you're quite right with that fruitcake flavour coming through, you know. Yeah, the ABV or the proof is used, guys. Always like
109.2 or 54.6.
Definitely, yeah. It's up there at 109, which is very decent for a whiskey of this age. You know, we did notice quite a lot with some of the whiskies that were older, especially ones that matured in Oloroso casks.
Yeah.
Sherry casks, really old ones. They seem to keep their strength quite high, unusually high. And the only correlation we can have between that and strength was the quality of the oak in the casks that were made. The thickness of the staves were so thick that came from Spain that it seemed to slow the maturation down and keep that ABV quite high. And that's the only thought process we had behind that. So it was, which is great when you get that, you know. And I think it also keeps it quite fresh and lively as well. The whiskey itself, you know.
Yeah.
It's great for a whiskey this age because there's nothing worse than tasting a whiskey and it's very woody and it's very unpleasant. You know, very expensive to say the least. But
well, when you go back to it again, I'll let it sit a little bit longer. Like the fruitiness is the first part I got. Now, like the tannins, the like rich vanilla, like almost like Madagascar. Like you scraped the bean, right, of the Madagascar bean to get the vanilla out of that. Like that, not extract, right? Extract's a very specific flavor. This is more like you can see it's interacted with the wood tannin. So it's got that like extra bitterness to it. So like, I think that aged cask gives the rounded out bitterness of it that it needs to balance against the fruitiness that's sweet in that way.
Yeah. I mean, most definitely can. It's sometimes can be difficult to get that because you never plan it. You just hope that things are going to kind of work out, you know? I mean, when you try and create whiskies, I mean, it's almost impossible to create a whiskey like this logically in 50 years ago, 30 years ago, whatever. You just need to know your spirit, how you make it, what style it is, light, heavy, the flavors that's in there, and how that's going to work with the cask as
Yeah.
well, And then the rest is it's out with their hands, The little angels, and they'll decide how it's going to work and all the rest of it. It's one of the great things with whiskey and maturation. It's one of the parts that is unknown. The most unknown part is the maturation. The most known part is obviously the distillation.
Yeah.
That volatile compounds, as you call them, is understanding that of how the spirit reacts with the copper and such like, and how the acids and alcohols come together. It's a very well known part of it, and that's the bit that we do understand greater than we've ever done, and to understand where the flavors and control them and manipulate to our advantage or whatever, in a positive way, obviously. But the cask maturation, it's we do know a good bit, but it has its own life as well. And
It does. Temperature
it
swings,
does.
different weather, all the things that could happen.
Yeah, and it's when I was across them, obviously Kentucky, which was an experience and a half. Like, it's just the size in the rick houses, which was just, I went to Lux Row,
Yeah.
which is fantastic. And went into the rock, and it was obviously 3 layers, and it was 7 high, so you had 21 layers, and I'm thinking, oh me, and the heat. You imagine the heat and the explanations you got about understanding the product, the bourbon, the Kentucky straight bourbon, and how it was the description of the whiskey gets pushed into the cask, which is completely the opposite way we think. We never think of it being pushed into the cask, and that it's the opposite way, because there's a slower, march.
A lot more mellow.
Yeah, I never thought that, but the understanding of the flavors from which part of the rick house and was great, and that understanding of your product and the environment that it's maturing. It's something I took from my visit with all the distillers and the care and attention to the products. So I must admit it was. I enjoyed it.
We gotta work together in this big whiskey community, whether it's with an E or with a Y,
brilliant.
right?
Yeah, the quality was definitely 100%. It was all there. The experiences was what when you went, you get showed around the sites, and then you got your tasting flight at the end. That was far superior to what we do in Scotland. About us, it's the distillery and heritage and smells and people and all that. But our tasting flights were nowhere near the extent of what we get. Well, I experienced in the States anyway. It was really, really, really good. Like Kent, so thoroughly enjoyed it. I'll have to go back sometime, like Kent. So.
Well, you come back, you let us know. We'll help you around. We know a few people.
Yeah, I'm actually I'm just not long back from the States. I was in Las Vegas.
Oh, nice.
Well, that's a different world.
Yeah, that is.
It was absolutely Sin City all the way. It was something else. That's all I can say.
It is
something else, but it was great.
Yeah,
loved it.
Awesome. Well, Keith, we really enjoy the opportunity to talk about Benromach, and especially the 50-year. This is an exceptional cask. It's $25,000. There's only less than 300 bottles of this. So thank you so much for letting us try it and help tell the story of Benromach here in the States. I think as world whiskey consumers, as we've become over the last 6 years, it's important to always know what's happening outside of the United States. There's a ton of good whiskey being created and crafted by our friends in Scotland, by our friends in Ireland, by our friends in Japan and Taiwan and wherever else it's being created. And I think people need to pay attention to this, whether it's a 10, whether it's, you have all the money in the world to spend on a $25,000 bottle of whiskey, go for it. It's exceptional. I will say that. It is a once in a lifetime sip for probably Scott and I both. So we really appreciate it. And thank you so much for hopping on the Bourbon Lens with us and talking about Benromach.
Excellent. Pleasure. It's been a pleasure. Yeah, as always, because I love, as I said, my experience in Kentucky one I'll never forget. No, and I love. Yeah, I must admit, my favourite is rye whiskey. There's a lot of fondness with that.
Oh yeah.
Oh wow.
Yeah, yeah.
Rye whiskey's good. I enjoy.
Very good. Yeah,
enjoy some good rye whiskey myself. Well, thank you so much for joining. We appreciate it. And as the Scotch say, sláinte instead of cheers.
Yep.
And we really appreciate it, man. Thanks for joining us.
Yep. Thanks very much, guys.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Keith.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Bourbon Lens. Make sure you're connected with Scott and I via social media on Instagram, X, and Facebook. We'd love to connect. And if you're more the professional type, follow us over on LinkedIn. If you want to know more about Bourbon Lens, make sure you're subscribed to our weekly newsletter, The Weekly Pour. For exclusive content and more, check out Patreon. Follow us there at Bourbon Lens. And last but not least, on your favorite podcast listening app, make sure you're subscribed because every Monday, Scott and I release a podcast, and we would love to have you here listening to the newest features and the newest whiskey news. And until next time, cheers.